At the Munich Security Conference yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine asked why his nation wasn't being admitted to NATO. That's in absolute contradiction to Russia's long-standing demand that Ukraine never be allowed to become a member of the Western Alliance. Is there any diplomatic maneuvering room here? Let me bring in the panel. Radek Sikorski was the foreign minister of Poland. Today he's a member of the European Parliament. Tom Graham was senior director for Russia at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Tom, let me start with you. It feels like the window for diplomacy is narrow. As far as I can tell, what Putin is doing is saying to the West, thank you for all your proposals on arms control, on troop force deployments, on all those issues, but the central issue remains Ukraine and NATO, and I'm not going to budge unless I get concessions on that. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think that's absolutely true. He's been saying this since December. He has three principal demands on NATO in Europe, and no eastward expansion into the former Soviet space, particularly in the Ukraine, is on the top of the menu. So he needs some satisfaction on that issue, and if we're going to have a diplomatic resolution to this problem, from Putin's standpoint, the United States and our NATO allies are going to have to be prepared to talk about the future of NATO in Europe and expansion.
Radek, let me ask you, before you put your foreign policy hat on, you were also Deputy Defense Minister of Poland. Does this look like a full-scale invasion to you? Do you imagine that the Russians would be willing to pay the cost of what would be a difficult occupation in a country in which most of the population does not want a Russian occupation?
Yes, I was defense minister and I was also a war correspondent, and it does look like all the pieces are in place for a massive invasion, a completely unjustified act of aggression against a democratic member of the UN in good standing.
And does it look to you like, people thought the strategy would be go into the Donbass, quote unquote, liberate those places, recognize them as independent republics like Georgia? Or do you think the strategy is actually go to Kyiv and occupy the capital, or replace Zelensky with some kind of Russian implant?
I'll do it in stages. First take Donbass, and if that goes well, if the resistance is less than Putin expects, he can go further. But on NATO, let's just remember that the West has done what Tom Graham proposed in our last interview a month ago. Namely, the Chancellor of Germany told him that Ukraine would not be admitted into NATO under his watch, and he may be in power for as long as Angela Merkel. This is a complete red herring. Ukraine applied to join NATO in 2008, was refused, and nothing has moved since then. President Putin doesn't want or need security guarantees. He wants Ukraine.
Tom Graham, does it appear to you that there is any room to maneuver, or do you think Radek is right that at the end of the day, Putin seems to nothing less than close to total control of Ukraine would seem to satisfy him?
Well, I think that Putin can calculate the risks as well. Certainly he is creating a situation in which he wants to keep the West off balance. He does want some concessions on Ukraine. But my sense is that there is a room for a solution along the lines of what I proposed before, but it can't come from the German Chancellor. It has to come from the United States. For Vladimir Putin, the United States is the key player in the West, and until there is some sort of agreement from the United States that Ukraine is not going to enter NATO at any time in the near future, he's going to maintain this pressure and keep pressing until he gets that type of concession.
All right, stay with us. We're gonna ask both of you, what would you do next in this complicated chess game? Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm joined by Radek Sikorski, former defense minister and former foreign minister of Poland, and Tom Graham, formerly the top Russian official at the NSC. So, Radek, what would you do at this point? Is it still possible to deter the Russians?
President Putin should be deterred by the deliveries of sophisticated anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. The Ukrainians now have an anti-tank missile for every Russian tank. And you know, those Stinger missiles were deployed in Afghanistan back in the 1980s when I covered that war. And they meant that the pilots had to go high. If you add to that US tactical intelligence, this might be a very different war from what Mr. Putin expects. And we should tell him in advance that we are ready to sustain a Ukrainian guerrilla war for 10 years if need be, and that we would increase our defense budgets, and that we would create a gas union and thereby extract a much better gas price from him. Those are the kinds of things that would deter him. The NATO issue is a red herring. You cannot enlarge NATO against the will of Germany, and Germany has said it's not happening.
Radek, what is your sense from Munich and, of course, from the time when you were foreign minister? Would the Europeans go along with the kind of hardline strategy you're suggesting?
I think when bombs start hitting population centers where thousands of people are being forced to flee, perhaps millions, the attitudes will change, and those things that I'm talking about will happen. The point is that some of our politicians seem to be too timid to say it to Putin in advance, to deter him.
Tom, do you think that some kind of military deterrent would work? Because it does seem like Putin has built a kind of sanctions-proof economy, $600 billion of foreign exchange reserves, oil prices at $100, gas prices up 400%. Do you think that you could get by with just economic sanctions?
No, not at this point, for the very reasons that you mentioned. In addition, Putin almost knows through his own intelligence sources, he has some idea about what the United States plans to do, how unified the alliance is going to be in applying those sanctions, and he's already taken that into account in his planning. Second, he does believe that there'll be spillover effects from these sanctions into Europe and elsewhere, and he does believe that the Russian people are tougher and more resilient than Europeans are. Whether that's a correct assessment or not is another matter, but that's the way he thinks. So economic sanctions are not going to be sufficient to deter him at this point.
Are there costs for the American people, Tom? I mean, do you think that the Biden administration has prepared the United States? Obviously, we're not going to go to war over this, but you could have an energy crisis like the 1970s, right?
Right. I mean, the Biden administration has done a superb job in rallying the alliance so far. What it needs to turn to now is preparing the American public for the spillover consequences of a major military operation in Europe. Not only is it energy prices, but if we launch the sanctions that we say we are, we have to be prepared for cyber attacks by the Russians against our critical infrastructure, against our financial system. So the Biden administration needs to do more to prepare the American people for the possible sacrifices that might come with deterring Russia, pushing back against Russia, not only in the next several days, but for months to come. We're in a new type of situation with Russia, a new normal. We're going to be facing this challenge for many years forward.
It does feel like a new world. Radek Sikorski, Tom Graham, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Next on GPS, I will give you my take on how the U.S. is pushing its two biggest rivals, Russia and China, closer together when there is another way out.